I follow you on Instagram, and you announced that you got engaged, and
Yeah.
just say congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate
And
that.
not to intrude, but I see you have some collectibles in the background. Can you tell me what those are?
Let's see. So, yeah, this is this, but I'm at my fiance's house now, but both of our houses are full of original comic stuff. So this is done by Milt Caniff, who's a newspaper cartoonist, really famous guy, sort of 40s, 50s. He did a strip called Terry and the Pirates, and then what was his other big one? Buzz Sawyer, I think. Anyway, he used to do these. What do you call it? He called them sort of chalk talks, where he would give a talk at a library or school or something like that, and he would have a big tablet like that size on an easel, and as he was talking, he would draw a character from his strip. And so we saw that at an antique show at some point and picked it up. So that's one of his characters from Terry and the Pirates. It's the first kind of like really popular sort of adventure newspaper strip, and then that over there is by a cartoonist named Durf. And I don't exactly know. I think maybe that's an original for some exhibit of like a show of all of his work. But he did oh, he's done a ton of stuff, but he did a weekly strip called In the City. But he's probably best known these days for doing a book called My Friend Dahmer. 'Cause he went to high school with Jeffrey Dahmer, and
Nice.
he wrote a book about it. And then he's got a book out right now about the Kent State shooting that he's getting some attention for. So, and both Ohio connections too. But Kniff's an Ohio guy, as is Durfster's up in Cleveland.
And the Kent State shooting story, will this be a comic book or a regular
It
book?
is, it is, and it came out. Actually, it came out, I guess, on the anniversary. It's just called Kent State. It's a graphic novel. It's about 250 pages, I think, and it came out. Unfortunately, the anniversary of that was right in the pandemic, so he really hasn't had a chance. Didn't have a chance to promote it until the previous year. So, but yeah, it's out. It's really good.
Yeah, speaking of history comics, I've been asked to freelance a history comic on Lakeside Chautauqua.
Oh, interesting. Nice.
Yeah, so looking forward to illustrating that, and I've actually been asked to illustrate some other comics for folks out in Los Angeles, California.
Oh, nice. Well, you better get. I
Oh
can tell you,
yes,
since that's my main gig. That's it's fun work, but it's hard and it takes a lot of time.
oh yes.
So I'd block some time out in your calendar.
Thank you. And when I was at CCAD, and when you taught me at CCAD, you told a story that you used to do some animation for Aquaman. Which Aquaman was that?
Oh, that was very, very minor. That was my when I was in grad school, you had to do either an internship or an externship. So basically, you either had to sort of do some teaching. You basically were either a TA or you kind of went out in the field somewhere. And I wound up working very briefly for an animation studio in Atlanta, Georgia, and they did a lot of stuff for Cartoon Network. And I think the Aquaman thing that they were working on at the time was just one of those little spots that kind of goes in between, like a 30-minute show,
Mhm.
which is a little like, couple of minute Aqua thing. What else were they working on? Um, we were doing a thing with Courage the Cowardly Dog.
Love that
I don't,
show.
but it was for Cartoon Network LA, though, Latin America, so it was all in Spanish. I think those were the two big projects that were going on when I was there as an intern. Um, but yeah, that was kind of an interesting experience. I'm obviously a comics, as in like comic books, graphic novels kind of person, and I
Same.
kind of got it in my brain. I was like, well, I'd done a little bit of animation work I'd taken a few animation classes, and I knew a little bit about animation. I was like, well, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to get a little animation experience, since that's easier to get a gig working in animation than doing your own comics. But it was one of those situations where I think it's just as valuable to learn what you don't want to do as it is to learn what you do want to do. And I definitely learned that I did not want to, I didn't enjoy the real kind of rote process of, drawing hundreds of drawings to make, Aquaman's arm move for 2 seconds. I realized whatever I wound up doing, I wanted to do something where I was kind of in charge of a narrative, that I got to execute. Um, but it was a valuable experience, because of that.
And was that when you realized you wanted to go into comics? Was that your inspiration? Your life.
No, I was there in school to study comics, and comics has kind of already been always kind of been my passion. It was just one of those things where I thought, well, here's an opportunity to, it's never bad to have a broad skill set. And I thought, well, here's an opportunity to be able to, have some animation, some actual animation stuff from a studio kind of on my resume and to know how to do this stuff. And again, that's not a bad, I certainly learned some stuff while I was there. It just didn't wind up. It's not my life's passion. It was more of a kind of a brief diversion with an eye towards practicality of the job market.
Very cool. And what was the very first comic book that you illustrated?
Oh, let's see. Well, I mean, as far as stuff that actually got published, I started working on um, I guess I didn't, I'm not sure I really conceived of it as a book when I started working on it, but I did a short story, maybe like, I think I did 4 or 6 pages in graduate school as part of some class. I can't even remember which one. And it was just a comics version of a folktale, which is, not a bad way to kind of get to test your chops because at least it takes the sort of writing element out of it a little bit and allows you to just you get use the story that's public domain like a fairy tale or a myth or something like that, and then you're able to kind of really focus on drawing and narrative storytelling and stuff like that. um, so I finished one of those for some class in graduate school, and I thought, well, hey, this is pretty cool, and I think I found a way to. I was like, well, this would be good if I had a bunch of these together. I might have like a book's worth of stuff. And so while I was in graduate school, I kind of found a way to do a few more of them kind of as coursework. So I think I had 3 of them done by the time I got out of school, and they were all anywhere from like 6 to 10 pages a piece. And then I think I maybe did one more once I got out of graduate school, all folktales, illustrated folktales as comics. And I pitched that to a few publishers, and that got published not too long after I got out of school. So that would be my first book, and it was called Farewell Georgia, partially because I was leaving Georgia where I was in school, and then also thematically they were all folk tales that related to the state of Georgia. They took place in Georgia, or they were from some source from Georgia.
Very cool. And can you find these books on Amazon?
Thankfully that one you can't find very easily. That's one that my drawing's a little rough in that, so I'm kind of happy to have that one kind of
Understood.
sort of vanish into the ether. Some things are best left out of print. Not that I'm not embarrassed by it, but it's just I feel like I've done better work since then. So that one I'm fine. You can find most of my work is online. I did a book called Midnight Sun after that. That's a historical fiction thing about a crash of based on a true story of an airship crash in the 1920s at the North Pole. That's been out of print for a while, but there's still copies floating around. I did a book about Amelia Earhart for Disney, Hyperion. It's kind of a graphic novel for young readers. That's out there. It's out of print for a little while, and then Disney's brought the whole series back into print, so it's out with a new cover and some changes. What else I did? I did a book called Oyster War that's Oni Press did. That's readily available. And then my last book is called Four Fisted Tales. It's true life stories about animals used in war and combat, and that's relatively recent, so it's in print as well. So pretty much all my stuff except for that very first book are in print. And then I did a smattering of shorter things that showed up in anthologies and stuff like that, and those things are all in dollar bins somewhere.
Mhm. And when you were saying something about Disney a while back, uh, recently Steamboat Willie entered the public domain, and
Yes.
what's your reaction behind that?
Entered the domain kicking and screaming. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I'll be curious to see what kind of work we get out of it. I think that as with when Winnie the Pooh entered the public domain, was that last year or something? And you
Mhm.
immediately got
Yeah.
some very gratuitous, like Winnie the Pooh slasher movie. I think, people's first impulse is it's to sort of be uh, uh, confrontational and sort of quasi-offensive just because you can now. That's not really my bag. It'll be interesting to see what people do with it. Because public domain works a little differently in Europe than it does here, you can kind of get a preview of how some of that stuff has been working if you look at what goes on as things enter the public domain overseas. So, for example, there's been a real explosion of really interesting Conan comic books in the last 5 years because I think Conan is still copyrighted here, but I think it's in the public domain now over there. So you've gotten some really interesting stuff. And I think Disney stuff is also maybe Popeye is in public domain over there, so you see some interesting Popeye stuff.
Makes
It's one of
sense.
those things where I think the public domain is something that's very important to maintaining a healthy creative environment in society. It's kind of a trade-off, which is that it's there's a the government protects your work for a certain amount of time, and expend some resources doing that, allows you to profit off it, and then in exchange for that protection, that period of protection, you then contribute. Your work then becomes part of the sort of the cultural stew.
Mhm.
Now, of course, that's a very idealistic reading of things, and you get people like Disney who have, for obvious reasons, just really resisted wanting their stuff to pop into the public domain, because obviously they're using it to generate money. So there's other takes on it that are probably more nuanced than mine, but I don't know that I'm not someone who's been waiting around with bated breath to do my to do a Steamboat Willie comic. So it's to me it's more of an academic kind of thing to think about than anything that like I'm super excited about on a creative level. Um,
It's funny because I realize that Nosferatu, I mean, is public domain, of course, but in some
hmm.
European countries, it's not public domain yet.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah, which I was very surprised by that. And for artists who want to go into comics, go into graphic comics, and a person like myself who's going into
Hmm.
comics as well, what is the best advice that you would like to pass on?
Oh, that's kind of so that's a very broad it's a broad question. I think one thing I always try to kind of impress on my students is that it's sort of a long haul. It's not like if you're talking about a creative field, it's very tempting to look at the examples of people who, pop right out of school and immediately are incredibly successful. Like I'm trying to think of well, like Nicole Stevenson is somebody that's probably on people's brains now. She's a person who was at, maybe I think she's at the, um, we're at some art school. I don't know where they were. They did a webcomic called Nimona. It immediately got picked up by like Simon and Schuster, became a successful graphic novel. They wound up, I think, maybe doing some writing work for She-Ra. And now there's an animated series coming out of Nimona. And I think it's always very tempted I mean, it's cool when you see people be successful like that, but I think people get it in their brains that that's the way it works. And the flip side of that, it can be sort of a trap, which is that if it doesn't work like that for you, then you're like, oh my God, I'm a failure, or like this is terrible. And I think that a big piece of advice I always tell people, students or otherwise, is that you in most creative fields, it's kind of a long sort of you got to play the long game where you gradually move from doing things that are less close to what you really want to be doing. And then as your career progresses, you hopefully get to where the point where you're doing more and more of what you really want to do and you can afford to say no to the things that you don't really want to do. So I mean, I know when I started out right out of school, I had a comic that came out, but that wasn't paying any bills or anything really. um it brought in some money, but I was mostly just doing any kind of thing I could, any gig I could get illustration wise. And I would take anything basically that paid. I was doing storyboarding work, I was doing greeting card illustrations, I did coloring books, just basically anything you can think of that involved drawing, and a check showing up at my house, I would do. But over the years, I got better clients, you get a better client base, you get better gigs, and then you get to the point where hopefully you're able to say like, okay, well, I'm not going to take that. That's not what I want to be doing. Excuse me. Or it doesn't pay that well. And then eventually one hopes, the goal, of course, is to get to a point where you are basically doing exclusively stuff that you want to do, you know. Um, that you're telling the stories you want to tell, or you're doing the kind of illustration that you want to do. So it's not. I think that there's a lot of people up. It comes up particularly in comics where people always talk about like, how do you break into comics? I'm like, well, what do you mean break in? Like, I mean, you draw some stuff and then you publish it, right? Like, does that mean you're broken in? Are you broken in when like someone else publishes? Are you broken in when you have enough money from it to like pay your rent? Like, I don't know. It's like it's not a. People act like it's sort of this sort of flipping of a switch, and no, in a creative field, it usually isn't. Particularly in stuff like, particularly if you're going to go sort of the freelance route, where it's not like you're walking into Leica Studios and working 8 hours a day. You know, it's more of an amorphous thing that it's not just sort of a binary offer on switch. You know.
Understood. And we're coming down to the end of the interview, and we have two questions. We have the
Sure.
classic retro question, and we also have a question from my mother. Now, the question from my mother is, what was your favorite board game?
Was my favorite board game or is my favorite board game?
Oh, what is your favorite board game?
Oh, let's see. So, honestly, I kind of float around. I love board games. I guess I'll have to. I'll cheat and do a sort of an all-time and a current. So I've been playing backgammon a lot, which is one of those classic games that I just never really thought much about. And I was at a resort with my fiance and my daughter for Thanksgiving, and they had a backgammon game sitting in the little common area, and we started looking up on my phone, like, "Oh, how do you play this?" And it's a surprisingly interesting game. As far as sort of games that I play a lot, um, that's more classics. I have a real soft spot for a game called Labyrinth. And it's like a German board game. It's a movable maze tile-based game. And one of the things I like about it is I started playing it when my daughter was really young, and it's very difficult to find games that are challenging enough that they are fun to play if you're an adult, yet are not so complex that they can't be played by a child. And that's a game that does that really well. And it's the kind of game I like, which is that the game mechanics are very simple, and you can learn how to play it in 10 minutes, but it's very challenging and very complex. So that's what I like a lot. I like that. I like the Keys to the Castle is another one I like a lot. Ticket to Ride is a great one, sort of a train route building
That's a
game.
fun one.
Yeah, that's a great one. We play. In fact, we took that one to LA, and I'm very sad that we couldn't convince the family to sit down for a grudge match of Ticket to Ride.
My grandmother gets really intense playing that game.
It's people get aggressive too. People buy tracks and put them up right in your way just to be a jerk.
And the finale retro question is, what was your favorite retro product growing up?
Retro product, meaning just like a currently retro.
Could be anything.
This will date me, but so I grew up. I was a kid in the '80s. So, my probably toys and stuff from the '80s would be something in there. I was at a toy show in Columbus recently and saw a bunch of stuff that I'd completely forgotten about. I'd probably go with Micronauts. It's really into Micronauts. There were these little. I think they were. I think much like Transformers, I think they were originally a Japanese toy that kind of got marketed over here.
Yes, yes, I
And
remember.
they were little, they were little about the same scale as like your old school Star Wars figures. But they had sort of a whole backstory to them, much like Transformers. And much like Transformers, I'm not sure how much of the backstory actually was part of the toys or how much of that came later when they got a Marvel comic made about them. Because a lot of the sort of Transformers backstory was completely invented when Marvel got a license to do Transformer comics, and so everybody thinks they're inherent to the toys, but they really aren't. So yeah, Micronauts I would pick. I was really into Micronauts when I was a kid. I wish I had them all. Of course, if they're toys that you played with as a child rather than like collecting as an adult and putting in your little glass case, they get beat up and thrown away and stuff. So I don't really have any more of them. But
Yeah,
I guess if I'd been willing to pony up some cash, I could have picked some up at the toy show, but they were all a little pricey.
understood. Do you still have some of your Star Wars figures? Because I remember when in class when we had to do, of course, when the lockdown happened and COVID happened, and we had to do virtual classes.
Oh,
You
I know what you're
use
talking about.
Yoda. Do you still have Yoda?
I do. I still have all of my Star Wars figures in their little carrying cases, and you can tell they're mine because they all have. You can look on the feet of them, and they all have a little bit of my mom's nail polish painted on them, so that I could tell them from my friends' Star Wars figures. But yeah, I still have all those. They're down in the basement somewhere. Um, but yeah, absolutely, I wouldn't get rid of those.
No, me neither. I mean, I'm not from the '80s. I was born '99,
Mm,
but still, I mean, I've been a fan of the '80s, like mainly movies, music, and
mm.
products. I have two Star Wars figures. That's Luke and Darth Vader, but that's all I have. But I will say, some of the things that I've collected have been Disney related. I don't collect
Mm.
anymore, but uh, one thing that I do have that's Disney related that was from the 80s is a plush of Roger Rabbit
Oh, wow.
when Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out.
Oh, that's great. That's a spectacular movie.
Animation's terrific.
It is. If you get a chance, you should see. There's a documentary called Persistence of Vision that's about the animator whose name is Roger. Oh, and I'm blanking on his name. The main animator that did Roger Rabbit, the guy who sort of pioneered that idea of taking animation and putting it over live action. He had a sort of pet project of his called The Cobbler and the Thief
Yes.
that he worked on for years and years and years, and it unfortunately kind of came to a real tragic end. But there's a documentary about it that's really amazing, and it has a lot of footage from it that's just from a technical animation standpoint is just jaw dropping.
Nice. I'll definitely have to check it out. Well, when I found this plush of Roger Rabbit, it was actually featured in Back to the Future Part 2 in the scene when McFly and Doc Brown go into the future and Marty's searching Hill Valley in the future. He comes to a store that shows like antiques from the 80s, and there's in the scene
Oh,
is
interesting.
a plush of Roger Rabbit merchandise from the movie, which I mean would make sense because
Yeah.
Zemeckis did both Back to the Future
Yep.
Roger
Yeah,
Rabbit.
that's kind of a cool little Easter egg.
That's actually what caught my attention. Is like, okay, if I ever see one of those, I have to get my hands on it.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Professor, thank you again for
I appreciate it. Thank you, Ben.
today's episode, and have a good one.
You too.